You're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm your host, Talia Baroncelli. Joining me today is reporter from The Lever, Katya Schwenk. She'll be joining me to speak about the liability and monopolization issues around the Boeing crashes, the cargo ship which crashed into the Baltimore bridge, as well as slush money funds funding police departments in the United States. We really can't do any of this work without you, so if you're in a position to donate, please go to our website, theanalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Most importantly, get onto our mailing list. That way you're always up to date every time a new episode drops. And like and subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube. See you in a bit with Katya Schwenk. Joining me now is Katya Schwenk. She's currently a reporter at The Lever, which was founded by David Sirota, and she's previously contributed numerous pieces to The Intercept, to The Baffler, and also worked at the Phoenix New Times. So thank you so much for joining me today, Katya.
Thanks for having me.
You've been doing a lot of reporting on the Dali, which is a Singaporean flagship, which actually lost power and then subsequently crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, ultimately killing 6 out of the 8 workers which were on the ship. And I think it was yesterday that the FBI launched an investigation into the ship. I think the crew members of the ship had been on the ship since March 26th, if I'm not mistaken. And so the FBI got a warrant and they've gone onto the ship to try to investigate whether there was some sort of electrical dysfunction. And at the same time, you have a U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland launching a criminal investigation into the incident to see if the crew members actually knew that there were these sorts of electrical issues when they started leaving the port of Baltimore. And, you know, according to U.S. law, you can't operate a ship and leave a port if the ship is not considered to be seaworthy or worthy for the journey and, you know, following all the necessary safety protocols. So what do you know of the investigation so far and the electrical issues which were also on the ship?
Yeah. So it seems clear at this point that the electrical issues were really the main driver of what, you know, caused this really devastating crash and then collapse of the bridge. We know that the ship lost propulsion minutes before it hit the bridge, just enough time for the crew to call some of the folks working on either side of the bridge to stop traffic, but ultimately they were not able to stop the ship before it collided with the bridge. So it seems, you know, these investigations are both in their early stages, and I think, you know, that we don't know. There are many details that are still yet to be uncovered, I think, here. But it does seem that it was really electrical issues with the ship that are sort of the main cause of the crash at this point. We have, as you said, the FBI now investigating. And there are some indications, this is according to reporting by the Associated Press, who, cited an anonymous source for this, that the crew of the ship was aware of electrical issues on the ship before it left the harbor in Baltimore on that day. And as you said, if the crew had been aware that there were these problems on the ship before on this journey, that could raise some serious questions about liability, both in the cases, both from this Baltimore, which is trying to seek damages from the ship's owners. If the ship was found to be aware of these issues, it could, lead to problems with that, lead to them being held liable for those damages, and have implications for the FBI's criminal probe into the crew and the ship's owners.
Yeah, there are a lot of really fascinating and strange aspects of this case. I think you reported at The Lever that the Singaporean company or the owner of the ship, so not the company which is charting the ship, which is a Danish company, Maersk, but the owner of the ship has invoked a 1951 maritime law to cap the ship's liability of collapsing the bridge and limit the liability to the value of the vessel's remains, which would currently be a total of 43.6 million US dollars. And this would essentially mean that the city would not be able to file for damages or claim damages against the ship's owner, and neither would the families of the victims. So do you know much about this weird maritime law and this legal loophole? Has it been used in previous contexts?
Yeah, this law has a long history, and it sounds complicated and like arcane, this kind of like, old maritime law, but it actually is really important because, as you said, we have this law on the books from, literally more than 100 years ago, from the 1800s, that is allows the owners of ships to limit the damages that they pay, even if they were, as happened here in Baltimore, responsible for very, very serious destruction to property, or, even more importantly here, the loss of lives of people, of workers, construction crew who was on the bridge. So, for decades, since the law was passed, ships have invoked it as a way to avoid paying damages. Most famously, it was used literally by the owners of the Titanic to limit the payout that they owed the passengers. And the idea behind the law, when it was passed, was we had a lot less, it was very different time, far less technology in terms of shipping. So owners had less access to information about conditions, the seaworthiness of the vessels. But now, of course, it's very easy for ship owners to monitor ships. They have access to maritime insurance. And so a lot of experts say we don't really need a law like this on the books. But, the shipping industry, anytime reforms have been proposed, has lobbied very hard to keep it on the books. And as you said, the, owner of this ship in Baltimore, which is essentially what seems to be a shell company in Singapore, is using this law to say, the price to rebuild the bridge is probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and of course we would, there may be damages that we could owe the families of those who lost loved ones, but we think that our damages should be capped at far less than that, at only, 43 million, because of this old law that allows us to do that. And so, it raises real concerns about how are we going to make sure that this shipping company is held accountable.
And do you know why this shell company was set up in Singapore? Was it presumably to pay fewer taxes, or do you know anything about that?
Yeah, they're in the shipping industry. The shipping industry is full of companies like this. It's that, because it is incorporated there, there's just it allows you to obscure who the ultimate owner might be. We know that this company, Grace Oceans Limited, Grace Oceans Limited owns, more than 50 other ships. But because it is incorporated, and that do business, of course, all over the world, but we have very limited access to the ownership information because of, where it's chosen to incorporate.
So obviously we don't know all that much about the FBI's investigation right now because it's in its early stages, but I did see reporting as to the contents of the containers on the ship, and apparently they were transporting lots of different hazardous material, I think class 9 hazardous material, which would be very corrosive or potentially explosive. And 476 of those containers were containing hazardous material destined to be taken to, I think it was Sri Lanka, and disposed of there, probably in an unlawful way, in a way that's obviously not good for the environment and not following certain procedures and laws. And I don't know if it was a transportation board that was monitoring the waste, but do you think that the FBI's investigation has anything to do with the perhaps illicit transport of this toxic waste?
Yeah, I don't know if we know. I'm sure it's something that they're looking at. I don't think we know at this point if it's part of, a significant part of their investigation. But yes, as you said, the National Transportation Safety Board, the federal officials that sort of monitor disasters like this have said that, there are more than, I believe, 700 tons of potentially hazardous material. We don't know at this point really what that material was, and we don't know how much of it could have ended up in the waters. I think all the officials have said, local officials, is there was some kind of sheen, like you can imagine, like sort of an oil kind of glistening look on the waters around the ship, which that's all the information that's been released so far about how the hazardous materials have come in contact with the water, and whether they could pose those kinds of safety concerns. I really think there should be more transparency around that, and I think the public really deserves to know, what was in those containers, and were any of them compromised during the collapse.
And you also did reporting on the Danish company which chartered the ship, the Maersk company, and apparently there was numerous accounts of people trying to report unsafe working conditions on the ship, and there was even a whistleblower or several. Could you speak about that as well?
Yeah, so this is the Danish company that, not the one that owned the ship, but as you said, that chartered the ship, was sort of managing its path, from Baltimore to Sri Lanka. And yes, we found sort of in the wake of the collapse, we began looking at Maersk's record in this area, and it's they've faced allegations in the past, and in fact faced sanctions by federal officials in the U.S. For violating labor law. And, in one, I think the most egregious case of this was, for a long time, it seemed that this company had a policy that if employees workers on a vessel had issues or safety concerns, they were to go to Maersk and its management first before they contacted the Coast Guard or other sort of U.S. authorities, which is a complete, the Department of Labor has said that's a complete violation of the law. And ultimately, they had, I think, fired or sanctioned a whistleblower who had gone to the Coast Guard with his concerns that were pretty serious concerns about safety issues on a vessel. And after being sanctioned, Maersk rolled back that policy. But I think it really speaks to some questions that are lingering about, treatment of workers on this company's ships, and whether that played a role at all in what happened in Baltimore.
So a lot of the stories you report on, either directly or indirectly, deal with the effects of monopolization or finding legal loopholes or corporate liability and corporations not doing their due diligence and also not maintaining certain standards. And it seems like in certain cases, there isn't really an incentive structure to incentivize safety, because perhaps safety isn't as profitable as, outsourcing some of your work to other companies. And this brings me to the case of Boeing, which I know a lot of people have been following, and you've also done reporting on together with other reporters at The Lever. And going back a few years to 2018 and 2019, people will recall the really deadly fatal crashes of Boeing 737 MAX passenger airplanes, which killed upwards of 350 people, as there were two crashes. There was one in 2018 and 2019. And a result of those crashes, after a few months, the 736 MAX passenger vessels were grounded for something like 20 months or so. And this was, at the time, Donald Trump was president, and the DOJ at the time, if I recall correctly, launched an investigation right before the Biden administration took power. And the result of this investigation was to actually sign a DPA, a deferred prosecution agreement. So maybe you could speak about what the issues were at the time and what that particular DOJ investigation was looking into, and perhaps what they overlooked intentionally. And then we can also speak about the recent incident of the Alaska Airlines airplane, in which, because of a faulty bolt, a door basically flew off, and there were several other issues with the plane.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this sort of sweetheart deal that Boeing got under the Trump administration, which has continued under the Biden administration, really is emblematic of these issues of, failing to hold companies accountable the ways that companies like Boeing, like these shipping companies have pushed for to limit corporate liability. Um, so, as you said, following the really, awful, devastating crashes of the Boeing planes in which, more than 300 people were killed, there was a lot of pressure to launch a criminal probe. But what happened, and, the Department of Justice did begin investigating. But what happened instead was they offered Boeing a sweetheart deal, a deferred prosecution agreement. But essentially, the terms of this deal were, as long as you pay a fine and, change some policies on paper, we're not going to take you to trial. We're going to drop the charges after a couple of years. However, that deal has come under question in recent months because, part of this deal was, requirements for Boeing to ensure that both employees at Boeing and its subcontractors were not engaged in any kind of fraud because, the sort of linchpin of this case was this fraud claim against Boeing that Boeing had concealed from federal regulators the really serious issues with the flight control system on its plane that led to, these deaths and the crashes. Boeing agreed that it was going to ensure that fraud was not continuing both at its suppliers and at the company. And what did we see, in recent months in the wake of, this Alaska Airlines incident, which I think, shocked everyone when, a panel blew off of a Boeing plane. We found that, as something we reported on, that there were serious allegations of fraud at the Boeing supplier that had manufactured that plane, that, workers said that they were told to misrepresent safety issues. And so now it seems that, federal prosecutors may be reconsidering that sweetheart deal, that's, which is set to expire in June. It's not clear yet whether that will actually be happen or be rescinded. But I think it really speaks to how, these companies have created this sort of favorable system where they're not held accountable after incidents like what we saw with Boeing in 2019 and 2018. And I think the fact that we've only seen these issues at Boeing continue to persist and continue to, be in the media, I think it shows that clearly, these deals and the way we've approached Boeing and companies like it are not working, and they're not fixing these problems or holding them accountable.
Yeah, so it seems like Boeing has been covering up a lot of the safety issues it actually knew about. And I wonder if this potentially relates to that whistleblower who was found dead. I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Barnett, I think he was found dead while he was making an appearance in court in South Carolina to talk about these issues, and he was found dead in his hotel room. So, I mean, is there any idea of what happened there?
Yeah, it's a really tragic story. In early stages of that investigation as well, indications that at this point he died by suicide. But, of course, I think everyone wants to see a full accounting of what led to his death. But, his case, I think, really does illustrate the lack of protections and safeguards for whistleblowers. His family has said he was under a lot of pressure and stress, in those weeks leading up to his death, because he had been involved in this fight with Boeing for years, right? So he was, John Barnett, he was a quality manager at Boeing who left the company, I believe, in 2017 after raising some serious safety concerns. I'm sorry, I don't remember if he left or was fired, but he experienced retaliation from Boeing for raising these safety concerns, launched a whistleblower lawsuit against Boeing. But because, the protections for aviation whistleblowers are so threadbare, and because these cases are not well resourced, his case dragged on for years and years. Boeing has, it seems that Boeing pushed that to happen. And so eventually, we have gone years without his concerns being addressed, and now he's been found dead. So I think really emblematic of a faulty, failed system for whistleblowers. And whose testimony seems to be more needed than ever because, again, we are seeing allegations time and time again that there have been safety issues at the company that Boeing executives or Boeing, senior employees knew about that were not made public. And whistleblowers are sort of our only way in those situations to get that information to the public.
Well, I think one aspect of this particular incident with Boeing is, the dire consequences of monopolization. And Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, I think it was in the 90s, following the end of the Cold War and the restructuring of different defense contractors under the Clinton administration. And you could argue that Boeing is essentially a state-subsidized company because the U.S. government has invested so much money into R&D of the company to kind of get it going, and so many great scientists have been involved in, aviation scientists involved in developing Boeing airplanes. But at the same time, it seems like what I was mentioning before, like these incentive structures aren't really there to ensure that safety is also profitable for its shareholders. And there was a sale in 2005 of Spirit Aerosystems. So Boeing sold Spirit Aerosystems. That's not to be confused with Spirit Airlines. And I don't know if at the time it was purchased by a private equity company or a private equity firm did a lot of investing in it.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you say, these, I guess, this tendency towards monopolization, which as a result comes with a lot of, terrible transparency and lack of oversight. How would you say this has fueled a lot of the issues that Boeing is currently experiencing?
Yeah, I think it's, critical to understanding what's happened with Boeing. We're seeing Boeing, prioritize its shareholders over safety because, as you said, that's what our system has encouraged it and allowed it to do. And I think the case that you mentioned of Spirit Aerosystems is very emblematic of that, and also sort of this trend of continually outsourcing that Boeing has done, outsourcing key parts of the supply chain and of the company to sort of both get some money for its shareholders and avoid liability. I think it's emblematic of these issues too. Spirit Aerosystems, once an important part of Boeing's supply chain, once its Wichita division, this company was spun off to a private equity firm, to great profits for, the executives involved at that time. And then, the private equity firm and expanded it, sold it again, or sold out its shares and made a lot of money over the years, and sort of left this company with very little oversight from Boeing. And I think, Spirit Aerosystems is the one who manufactured, the company that manufactured the plane involved in the Alaska Airlines incident, has had a long history of issues with defects at the company. And now Boeing is in talks to buy the company back again. So I think that whole saga really speaks to the way that, deregulation and this sort of increased focus on shareholders and profits at Boeing has led to this, these really serious concerns about safety.
Well, there's also another story that you've been reporting on, which I think is really fascinating, particularly in light of the different AI tools that are currently being used in, say, Israel's onslaught of Gaza. I mean, there was a report by Yuval Abraham on these different AI technologies, such as Lavender and Where's Daddy. Their AI mechanisms and tools are being deployed to increase the amount of targets of Palestinians and Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. So in light of the use of AI, you also reported on the sort of dark money slush funds that are funding the police, as well as the purchasing power and the ability of the police to sign contracts with surveillance tech firms and to buy these sorts of, I would say, probably similar technologies to then use them on marginalized communities and on other individuals when they're doing their quote unquote law enforcement. So this particular report was based on a working paper that was undertaken by scholars at the University of Chicago. A sociologist, Robert Vargas, was leading it. And they were looking at 2014 to 2019 tax returns and looking at the nonprofit tax returns of, I guess it would be of certain private donors and also of the police force to see how much money from private donors has been funneled to the police force. And something like 600 private donors donated to different police bodies throughout the United States, and approximately 461 million US dollars was given to these different police outfits. And this is probably an underestimate of how much money is actually going to the police, because this is just based on self-reporting. So how would you say, like, why is this significant? Because the police, obviously, they get a lot of public money as well, and the public money goes towards paying the police's salaries and to resources and all that sort of thing. So why does it matter that private companies or quote unquote non-profit entities are sort of secretly giving money to the police to purchase surveillance technology?
Yeah, I think it's an issue that is really significant, often one that goes overlooked. I think there's rightly been quite a lot of focus on the size of police budgets, municipal police budgets, which get unimaginable amounts of public money. And in comparison to that, the sort of private funding that police get, which is generally channeled through nonprofits like police foundations who might purchase equipment for local police, who might, give different, gifts to individual officers, who might just give funding, like a grant kind of funding to a police department, that sort of private money. It's often been less of a focus because it is so small in comparison to these public budgets. But I think what is really significant about this research and what it really demonstrates, as well as, work for years by, other researchers and organizers who've been looking at this issue, this money, this private money, is going to sort of extraneous things that police would probably not be able to get from their public budgets. As you said, public budgets are often, they're so large because they're funding ever higher salaries, ever more overtime for officers. But this often private money that police departments get is used to often buy, surveillance technology, drones, data analytics, predictive policing software, the kinds of AI tools that you mentioned as well that are, one, very concerning, that sort of expand the power of the police state and, increase over-policing in neighborhoods. And often this private money comes with less oversight than public money. So depending on the location, because their policies are totally different depending on the city, in some places, private money does not need to be accounted for and subjected to the same oversight as public dollars, which really allows police to use this as a kind of slush fund that they can do what they want with. And to your first point, I'll just say too that the AI tools that are being used in Israel, I think this is a really important part of the story, because Israeli technology, surveillance technology, and military technology that is used in Gaza is often exported to U.S. police departments. It's a long sort of symbiotic relationship between those two entities. And I think private funding of technology in the U.S. really only allows that kind of relationship to continue. So it's, a real issue of concern. And I think this new research, which I was, really glad to write about, really shows that the amount of private money that police are getting is far greater than we previously understood it to be. And so, raised lots of questions, I think.
So the report deals primarily with municipal police departments, right? So would you say that there are perhaps fewer regulations or oversight mechanisms of municipal departments compared to, say, immigration at the border, ICE officials or border guards at the border. I'm assuming that, or perhaps I'm wrong, that maybe there aren't as many sort of slush money funds for ICE in general because they need to declare, and there are probably more robust federal oversight mechanisms to declare where they're getting their funding and how they're using their public funding to purchase weapons or surveillance technology and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the report did not deal with immigration authorities, but I actually don't feel that I know enough to really say whether or not the private funding, if there are methods or mechanisms for private funding of, ICE and Border Patrol. And I think that is, another topic that we should, I would like to look more closely at, and that deserves more scrutiny. But I do think it is clear that, quite a lot of this sort of big network of private funding of police is really focused on local police departments, and sometimes even very small town police departments are getting, huge grants for, different military technologies or, tanks and things that we really don't. It's clear that, small town police don't really need to have. And so yeah, I think that's been sort of that local, how funding goes to these local police has been a big focus of the research so far, but I'm not fully sure how it compares to private funding for federal immigration authorities.
Well, it seems like it ties into the general garrison economy and militarization of the police that we've been seeing, not just in the U.S., but in other countries as well, and how the police are becoming increasingly more militarized, using sort of different sorts of techniques that have previously perhaps been more questionable, and getting direct military funding, and as you reported on, this sort of shadow private funding that is really hard to detect. So Katya Schwenk, it's really been great speaking to you. Thanks so much for all of your reporting. You're writing some of the most valuable and pertinent reporting at the moment, I think. So thanks a lot for taking the time and for joining me today.
Cool. Thank you so much, Talia. It's been great.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. We really appreciate all of your support and feedback as well. If you'd like to contact us, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news. Feel free to make a donation if you can. And thanks for watching.